It is before dawn on the 12th of January 1945, and you are in the driver's seat of a heavy tank on the west bank of the Vistula. The bridgehead around you is called Sandomierz, a scrap of southern Poland the Red Army has held since the previous summer. Frost covers the engine deck. Behind you, 4 other tanks of your company sit in a line under camouflage netting, their guns already loaded. Ahead, across a few miles of open snow, sits the German front, a belt of trenches and anti-tank guns and dug-in strongpoints that has not moved in months. At a few minutes to 5, the sky behind you turns white. Thousands of Soviet guns open fire at once, and the frozen ground under your tracks begins to shake. When the barrage lifts, your regiment will move first, straight at the strongpoints, because that is the exact job the machine you are sitting in was built to do. That machine was the Joseph Stalin II, the IS-2, and understanding what it did in the weeks that followed means first understanding one decision the Soviet Union made about it, long before it ever reached the Vistula. The decision was the gun. After the great tank battles of the summer of 1943, the Red Army had a problem it could measure. Its standard tank guns struggled to defeat the front armour of the newest German heavy tanks at the ranges where those tanks liked to fight. The answer the Soviets reached for was not a better tank gun. It was an artillery piece. They took a 122mm field gun, a weapon descended from the A-19 core gun, a barrel designed to throw heavy shells across long distances at fixed enemy positions, and they mounted it in a tank turret. The tank version of that weapon was called the D-25T. Its shell left the muzzle at about 2,560 feet per second, and to keep the recoil of a field gun from tearing the tank apart, the barrel wore a large muzzle brake at its end. The tank itself had not started out this way. Its first version had carried a smaller gun, an 85mm weapon, the same class of gun the medium tanks were already using. That gun was not enough to justify a whole new heavy tank, because it could not reliably defeat the newest German armour at long range, and a heavy tank that fought no better than a medium was pointless. So the Soviets pulled the 85mm gun out and dropped the far larger 122mm field gun in its place. The tank was rebuilt around the bigger weapon, rather than the weapon being chosen to fit the tank. That is the correct way to understand the IS-2. It is a hull and a turret wrapped around a field gun. That choice carried a price, and the price is the whole story of the tank. Because the gun came from artillery, it fired what is called separate loading ammunition. The shell and the propellant charge were 2 separate pieces, not one fixed cartridge. The loader had to heave the shell into the breech first, then load the charge behind it as a completely separate action, before the gun could fire again. A purpose-built tank gun firing fixed rounds, where shell and charge come as a single unit, could be reloaded in one motion. The IS-2 could not. Its practical rate of fire in combat was only 2 to 3 rounds a minute. The shell was also enormous. The armour-piercing round weighed about 55 pounds on its own, and the propellant charge was a second heavy load on top of that. A tank has only so much room inside its hull and turret. Once the designers had filled that space with a field gun and its bulky 2-piece ammunition, there was room for only 28 rounds. A T-34-85, the standard Soviet medium tank of the same period, carried closer to 60. The IS-2 went to war with less than half the ammunition of a medium tank and a slower rate of fire than almost anything it would meet. There was a human cost to that decision as well, inside the tank. Each of the 2 pieces the loader handled was heavy and awkward, and he worked them in a cramped fighting compartment while the tank pitched over rough ground. Loading the shell, then the charge, then closing the breech, over and over, wore a man down fast. In a long engagement, the physical labour of feeding the gun became a limit all its own, on top of the mechanical one. The gun set the pace of the fight, and the gun was slow. In exchange, it got the heaviest shell any tank on the battlefield could throw. That was the trade, made deliberately and with open eyes. Volume of fire, given up for weight of blow. Almost everything else about the tank follows from that single exchange. The question that matters is what that weight of blow actually did. Against German armour, the clearest record comes from Soviet firing trials at a proving ground called Kubinka. where captured German tanks were set up as targets and shot at with Soviet guns. Firing the D-25T at a captured Tiger, the testers found that the 122mm shell could penetrate the Tiger's turret front at ranges of 1,000 to 1,500 yards. At closer ranges, it cracks the welds and split the plate edges of the Tiger's hull. Against the Panther, the shell could defeat the front of the tank at normal combat ranges and could punch through the thinner side plate from as far out as 2 miles. These were the two tanks the German army counted on to dominate an armoured fight, and the IS-2 could defeat both of them at the ranges where battles were actually decided. A Panther or a Tiger crew hoped to open fire at long range, land the first hit, and finish an enemy tank before it could close. Against the IS-2, that advantage was gone, because the Soviet tank could answer at those same long ranges with a shell heavy enough to end the fight in one blow. The round doing this work in January 1945 was the BR-471, a blunt-nosed armour-piercing shell. Fired at a flat plate, it punched through about 150mm of armour at 500 yards and about 130 at 1,000. It is worth being careful about that figure, because a better round, an improved armour-piercing shell, is very often quoted for the IS-2 with much higher penetration numbers. That improved shell was developed in the spring of 1945 and issued in quantity only after the war had ended. It was not the round sitting in the racks during the winter offensive. The tank that led the January attack fired the earlier, blunter, lower penetration shell, and it was more than enough for the work in front of it. Armour penetration, though, was never the main job of this gun. The round the IS-2 fired most often was not the armour-piercing shell at all. It was the OF-471, a high-explosive shell. This is the part of the tank that usually falls out of the comparison, because the charts that rank tank guns only measure how much steel a gun can punch through, and that measure misses the point of this one. A 122mm high-explosive shell is a building breaker. It was built to knock down fortified strongpoints, collapse bunkers, and blow apart the stone and brick buildings of a defended town. When the Red Army chose this gun, it was not primarily shopping for a tank duelist. It was shopping for a weapon that could break a fortified line wide open, so that infantry and medium tanks could pour through the gap it made. Defeating a Tiger was a bonus the gun could also deliver. Breaking a strongpoint was the reason it existed. That single fact reframes the whole machine. The IS-2 was not a hunter waiting in ambush. It was a siege hammer, and it was meant to swing at the front of an attack. A hammer that leads an attack has to survive the first blows it takes, and the IS-2 was built to do exactly that. The version in service by January 1945 carried a sloped front hull with about 4 inches of steel, angled back so that incoming shells were more likely to glance off than bite in. The front of the turret was similarly thick and rounded, cast rather than welded, and the mantlet, the armoured housing wrapped around the base of the gun, was nearly 5 inches thick. An earlier model of the tank had used a stepped, upright nose plate. The redesign sloped that plate into a single, clean angle to make it far harder to penetrate, and it was that sloped version that led the winter offensive. The tank weighed about 51 tons in combat trim. Its road speed was about 23 miles per hour, slow for a battlefield crowded with faster medium tanks, and it carried a crew of 4 men. Every one of those numbers points in the same direction. This was not a machine built to race across open country. It was built to grind up to a defended line, take the first hits on its thick sloped front, and open a hole that would not close again. There were never very many of them, and that was also by design. Total production of the IS-2 came to about 3,854 tanks across the entire war. The first serial machines were completed at the very end of 1943. Bulk production began in the opening months of 1944 at the Great Tank Works at Chelyabinsk in the Urals, the plant so devoted to armoured vehicles that it had earned the nickname Tankergrad, the Tank City. Output climbed to as many as 250 tanks a month across the stretch from the late summer of 1944 through the early spring of 1945. Set against the tens of thousands of T-34s the Soviet Union turned out, that is a small and very deliberate number. Because they were few, they were never spread thin. The Red Army did not scatter its heavy tanks one or two at a time across its rifle divisions the way it handed out mediums. It gathered them into dedicated fists. The IS-2 was treated as a specialist tool, held in reserve and committed only where a fortified line actually had to be broken. The unit that held them was the Guards Heavy Tank Regiment. Each regiment fielded 21 IS-2 tanks, organised into 4 companies of 5 tanks each, plus a single command tank riding at the head of the formation. 3 of these regiments could be grouped together into a Guards Heavy Tank Brigade of about 65 tanks, but the regiment was the working unit on the battlefield, and these regiments belonged to no rifle division. They were independent breakthrough units, held at army level or higher, and moved by the front commander to whatever stretch of the line most needed its crust cracked open. One more detail marks how seriously the Red Army took these formations. A regiment would normally earn the honorific Guards in battle as a reward for proven performance under fire. The heavy tank regiments were granted Guards status on formation before they had fired a single shot. The distinction was built into them from the first day they existed. Stalin's name rode on the tank, and the word Guards rode on the unit, before either had been tested in action. The army was announcing in advance that these were elite formations reserved for the hardest work on the front. In January 1945, the hardest work on the front was the German line on the Vistula. The offensive that opened on the 12th of January 1945 is known as the Vistula Oder operation, and it was one of the largest and fastest attacks of the entire war. 2 enormous Soviet fronts drove it forward, fielding together somewhere around 2.25 million men, backed by dozens of rifle armies and 5 full tank armies. To the south, Marshal Ivan Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front broke out of the Sandomier's bridgehead on the 12th. To the north, Marshal Georgy Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front joined the attack 2 days later, on the 14th, driving out of bridgeheads on the Vistula near the towns of Magnuzu and Puchawai, straight toward Warsaw and the country beyond it. The attacks did not open with the long, hours-long artillery preparations of earlier offensives. Zhukov's front went in behind a short, savage barrage of about 25 minutes, meant to stun the forward German positions and then get out of the way before the defenders could recover. So the tanks and infantry hit the line while its defenders were still reeling. Speed was built into the plan from the opening minute. The German defence the barrage fell on was not a single trench line. It was a zone several belts deep, prepared positions layered one behind another, exactly the kind of fortified depth that a fast attack could bog down inside if it lost momentum. The heavy tanks existed to make sure it did not. They were attacking into German Army Group A, commanded by Colonel General Joseph Harp. On paper, Harp held a continuous, layered defensive front several belts deep. In practice, his forces were badly outnumbered by something on the order of 5-1 at the points of attack, thinly spread across a very wide sector, and pinned in their forward positions by standing orders from Hitler that forbade any timely withdrawal. The Soviet plan was to smash through those defensive belts in the opening hours, before the defenders could react, and then never stop, driving armoured spearheads deep into the German rear before any new line could be formed behind the old one. The heavy tank regiments led the smashing, and the opening phase was the exact task the IS-2 had been designed for. They drove straight at the fortified strongpoints, the anti-tank gun belts, and the defended villages. They put their 122mm shells into the strongpoints at short range, and they broke the crust of the defence so that the medium tanks and infantry massed behind them could flood through the opening. Once the front had torn, the same heavy regiments turned to holding the shoulders of the breach and beating off the German armoured counterattacks, while the faster forces behind them carried the advance forward. This was the campaign the high-explosive shell had been waiting for. As the advance rolled west across Poland and into Silesia, it ran up against exactly the targets the gun was chosen to break: defended villages built of stone, fortified strongpoints, and old towns turned into pockets of resistance. Many of them declared fortress positions to be held to the last. Against a tiger the crew would reach for the armour-piercing round, but against a barricaded building or a bunkered gun position, the loader chambered the OF-471, and 122 mm of high explosive did to a wall what no medium tank's gun could match. Every strong point the heavy regiments knocked flat was a place where the advance did not have to slow down, wait for artillery to be brought up, or bleed infantry against a position that could simply be blown apart. That was the whole reason the gun had been chosen over a lighter, faster-firing one, and in January 1945 it paid off across a front hundreds of miles wide. The pace of that advance was extraordinary. On the 17th of January, Soviet troops entered Warsaw. On the 19th, Konev's forces secured Krakow, taking the city largely undamaged after a swift encirclement, forced the German garrison to pull out in a hurry rather than stand and fight. Konev then swung his armies to close on the great industrial basin of Upper Silesia, and by careful manoeuvre he pried the defenders out of it and captured that region and its factories very nearly intact. Across Poland and into Silesia, the leading spearheads were covering something like 25 to 30 miles a day, day after day, a sustained rate of movement that almost no army in the entire war ever matched. Army Group A came apart under the weight of it. Harpy's front did not bend back and hold together in good order, it collapsed. The German High Command answered the collapse the only way it knew how, by feeding in its most prestigious reserve. On the 15th of January, Hitler ordered the Panzerkorps Großdeutschland, one of the most famous armoured formations in the entire German army under General Dietrich von Sorcken, moved westward from East Prussia to plug the breach that had been torn in the front. It never reached its objective. Zhukov's advance was moving so fast that the corps was forced to detrain far short of where it was needed, near the city of Audig, and it was swept up in the general retreat before it could form any solid block. The 24th Panzer Corps, committed alongside it, was driven back over the rivers in the same collapse. The reserve meant to stop the offensive was simply overrun by the offensive. Harp paid for the failure with his command. He was relieved and replaced by Colonel General Ferdinand Schörner as the front continued to fall apart. But the change of commander at the top changed nothing on the ground. The Soviet spearheads reached the Oder in the last days of January and seized crossings near the town of Kustrin. From the Vistula bridgeheads to the Oder was about 300 miles, and the Red Army had covered that distance in roughly 22 days. The lead elements now stood about 40 miles from Berlin. That is the true measure of what the winter offensive did. In 3 weeks it carried the Red Army from central Poland to the doorstep of the German capital, and it was the slow, heavy, short-legged IS-2, the siege hammer, that had led the breakthroughs at the very front of the fastest strategic advance of the war. And then, on the Oder, it stopped. The halt was not the work of the German army, which was in no condition to force one. The advance had simply outrun itself. Supply lines now stretched back 300 miles over ruined roads and captured rail, and the fuel and ammunition could not keep pace with the spearheads. More dangerous still were the flanks. To the north, in Pomerania, and to the south, in Silesia, large German forces still held ground, and the Soviet drive straight west onto Berlin would have bared both of those flanks to a counterattack. Konev's capture of the Silesian industrial basin, taken nearly intact rather than fought to rubble, mattered here too. It stripped the German war economy of one of its last great sources of coal and steel without wrecking the factories the Soviets would inherit. So the front commanders chose to hold on the Oder, secure the bridgeheads around Kustrin, clear the exposed flanks first, and build up for the final blow. The offensive that reached the Oder in January did not take Berlin. It set the stage for the operation that would, 3 months later. None of this means the tank was without hard limits, and those limits are worth naming plainly because they are the other half of the trade the designers made. 28 rounds was very little to carry. A heavy tank in a long engagement could fire itself empty and have to pull back to replenish while the fight was still going on around it. The 2 to 3 rounds a minute meant that a German Tiger or Panther crew, working a faster loading gun, could get off several shots in the time it took the IS-2 to fire once. The tank's answer to both problems was the same. It had to see the enemy first, and it had to make the first hit count, because it might not be given many chances. A single 122mm shell placed correctly ended the argument outright, But the crew of an IS-2 could not afford to stand and trade blow for blow. Both of those limits trace back to a single root cause, the separate loading ammunition, which was itself the direct and unavoidable cost of choosing a field gun. Everything the tank surrendered, it surrendered in order to carry that one heavy shell. And it was slow, and it was heavy. At about 23 miles per hour and about 51 tons, the IS-2 could lead a breakthrough, but it could not chase one. Once the German line was broken, and the pursuit opened up across the country, the running was done by the lighter, faster T-34s, and by the tank armies rolling behind them. The heavy regiments cracked the door. Others sprinted through it. So the honest verdict on the IS-2 is not that it was the best tank of the war, and it was never trying to be. It was not the finest tank killer on the battlefield. It did not carry enough ammunition for a drawn-out fight. It could not move fast enough to exploit its own success. Every one of those was a known and accepted cost, weighed and signed off in the design office in exchange for one thing: the heaviest gun any tank carried, a weapon that could crack a tiger's turret at 1,000 yards or bring down the wall of a fortified town with a single shell. It was a siege hammer on tracks, few in number, slow to load, short on ammunition, and issued only to elite Guards regiments held back for the hardest work on the front. And in January 1945, the Red Army lifted that hammer against the German line on the Vistula and swung it, strong point after strong point, for 22 days without stopping, until the men who drove it were standing on the banks of the Oder, about 40 miles from Berlin, looking west across the last stretch of ground before the German capital.